Hello everyone, this is Kristen Huber, and on behalf of CA Technologies and 451 Research, I would like to welcome you and say thank you for attending today's webcast titled Shift Left, How Testing Early and Often is Best for the Business and Customer. Leading off the discussion today will be Nancy Goring, who is Senior Analyst of Application and Infrastructure Performance for our Development, DevOps, and IT Ops group at 451 Research. Following Nancy will be Steve Feloney, who is VP of Products at CA Technologies. Just a couple of quick housekeeping items before we get started. Number one, after the presentation, we'll have a brief Q&A period. To ask a question, simply type it in the question box on your screen below, and we'll get to as many as we can. We will respond to all unanswered questions via email after the webcast concludes. Second, this presentation and slides will be made available to all attendees once the webinar is complete. And finally, please provide feedback at the end of the webinar. And with that, I'll turn it over to Nancy.
Great. Thanks a million, Kristen, and thanks everyone for joining us today. So, I'm Nancy Goring. I'm a senior analyst here at 451, and I follow monitoring and performance testing topics. And I'm going to talk just very briefly here. I'm going to start off with kind of a big picture explanation about trends that have kicked off the shift left movement. I'll show some research that backs up these trends, and then I'll introduce a couple of topics that Steve and I can discuss. So from a very high level, we are seeing that IT teams are feeling pressure to move faster. So this was a survey question where we asked, what's the most important goal for your organization's IT environment over the next 12 months? And you can see the top answer here was respond faster to business needs. Reducing costs is probably, pretty predictable, and improving reliability and availability is the, third top thing that folks mentioned as their goal for their IT organization. And my point here is that this need for speed is putting a lot of pressure on IT organizations. And what we've seen has started happening is that some teams, I've heard some, pretty big name organizations talk about skipping testing altogether because for them, testing was slowing things down. So in order to drive their release schedules, they were just skipping it altogether. And obviously, there was an ensuing drop in quality. So, these teams began to look for ways to ensure that they could do, good testing practices without sacrificing speed. And one way that this has happened is by executing testing earlier in the development process in order to identify problems sooner and fix them. And this has helped a lot of organizations continue to move faster. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, but I want to also introduce some additional research that we have that I think is really interesting around organizational trends that we're seeing in IT groups. And I'm presenting this sort of as a backdrop to some topics that we'll touch on in greater depth in a couple of minutes. So here we asked, which of the following best characterizes the layout of your IT technical teams? And you can see here, so that the dark blue on the right is kind of what I would think of as a traditional makeup of an IT team, so primarily specialists. But what we're seeing is more of a shift towards generalists and towards DevOps pros. And this is particularly interesting in the context of QA. So I'm seeing it in a whole bunch of different specialties within IT groups, but QA is particularly interesting here, where what we're seeing is that while there, the sort of more advanced organizations that I see, there continue to be some QA pros, but a lot of the testing work is being executed by either generalists or DevOps pros. And again, this is sort of part of the concept of shift left. And we'll talk about this a little bit more, but another interesting thing about this change, this sort of change in dynamics within IT organizations, is that it corresponds at the very least with cloud adoption. I think it, anecdotally I can say it corresponds with, the adoption of more advanced technologies, but our research for sure shows that it corresponds with cloud adoption. So let me just walk you through what this slide is showing you. So basically, what this is showing is that if you look at the top set of bars there, that is respondents who said that they are in broad production of cloud technologies. And these are the folks that are least likely to have IT teams made up of specialists. Their teams are most likely to have primarily DevOps folks. They're also least likely to have generalists, but I think that that's sort of a factor of the fact that they have more DevOps folks. So down the road, I'm seeing this interest in more and more generalists on IT teams who can do a lot of functions, including potentially some testing work, and fewer specialists. So what I want to do now is step back for just a second and kind of define some terms, because what we're talking about here is shift left. You may hear people talk about that often sort of in the same breath as continuous testing. I know I do that. There's, sort of some subtle differences between these two concepts. So I thought we would pause here and kind of define some terms so that we're all on the same page in terms of what we're talking about here. And actually, I'm going to hand this one over to Steve. Do you want to chime in about kind of how you define continuous testing and shift left, and how you think those two concepts are different?
Oh, sure. Hello, Steve Feloney, VP of Products at CA Technologies. So when it comes to continuous testing to me is across the entire cycle. It starts well over with requirements, goes through development, goes through any sort of testing, integration, and all the way into production. So continuous testing really means continuous. It's really continuous validation. You're validating that you're delivering what the business is requiring and validating that it functions the way that your users or your customers expect. So it's continuous validation across the entire cycle. Now, in order to do continuous, say with continuous testing, there has to be a shift left that happens. So shift left is part of continuous testing, but they're not the same thing. And so what does that mean by shift left? It just means that, at least from the testing point of view, right, shift left means a lot of things. You could be shifting over production deployments and other things, but it's these agile teams. And it's generally almost always in sort of some agile teams where they are now doing a lot of the testing. So you have the developers or testers as part of the agile teams, and they're testing early and often, right? So they're testing while the development is going on. They're not waiting to hand it over the wall. They're not waiting to have the entire service or the entire application built, handing it over the wall to a big testing organization to do the testing. So shift left means developers and agile testers are now doing a lot more testing. They're doing API testing, functional testing, performance testing, security testing. They're doing the testing, but they're doing that while the development's going on. So it's shifting left. But that's just part of continuous testing, because continuous testing is validating that the requirements are right, validating that as you're developing, that the users that you're building for, validating that they want what that is. It is doing the testing, the UI testing, the functional testing, the unit testing, and all that. And then it is also monitoring in production and doing some testing in production as well, because what you're getting there is the feedback to come back into the development teams and the business to continually improve, because it's continuous validation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and it's a lot. You made one particularly good point there, which is that
only one?
No. Well, you validated a lot of what I, sort of my thinking about these two concepts. So I kind of think of continuous testing as defining the practice around doing testing throughout the continuous development process, versus shift left, which has more implications around cultural shift. It kind of refers to who's doing it. But the one thing I wanted to call out about what you said, which I thought was really interesting, is that shift left is really just a part of continuous testing, because continuous testing encompasses the idea of shift left in terms of doing shifting earlier in the process, shifting it left, but continuous testing also encompasses more than that, right? Because like you said, it includes doing testing throughout the process, which may include testing during production and other steps along the way. So I think that's really a good way to think of it.
Yeah, so continuous testing has a shift left component and a shift right component.
Yeah, exactly. Cool. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about how you do it. So how you shift left, and a lot of the things we'll talk about here also touch on continuous testing, obviously. I kind of think of ways to approach shifting left in two buckets. One is sort of cultural and organizational changes that have to happen, and the other is around technology changes and adoption that have to happen. So let's start with cultural changes. So these are sometimes often the hardest, right? I mean, these are the things that I hear from businesses that they're really struggling with, are these cultural changes. So there has to be a willingness among developer teams to learn about and embrace testing, right? So these are people who, like Steve said, are used to doing their job of development and then tossing their code over the wall to testers to do their job. So they're used to thinking about this bifurcated work. So developers have to be willing to learn about and do some testing themselves. At the same time, there has to be a willingness among QA pros to make some changes also. So sometimes that means that they have to actually learn some more development skills. But also, I think one of the key things in organizations that I've talked to who've done this really successfully is positioning the QA pros that you have as sort of a service provider in a sense. So these are the folks who are the experts at testing, and they're helping out the development teams to figure out what are the best tools to use, how to incorporate testing into their processes, what kind of tests they should be doing, is the testing that they're doing, proper, because again, these developers probably don't have the years and years of experience that the QA pros do. So
yeah,
but this is a shift in
say
thinking.
To that,
yeah.
Sorry, one thing. What I say to that, so a lot of people are used to COEs being centers of excellence, and the COEs have been transforming and going away, and what I say, exactly what you just said, I just call it, you can keep the same letters, keep COE, but it becomes a center of enablement, where they enable those agile teams. So, sorry, I didn't interrupt.
No, that's great. That's exactly right. So this can be a challenge, I think, in some cases for QA pros, because they're used to being the ones who are actually executing, they're doing all the testing, whereas in this shift they're helping out other people to do it. So it's a little bit of a mindset, and that can be sort of a challenge, I think. Obviously there has to be a close working relationship between developers and the QA pros. And there has to be, one thing that I've found is really key is the ability to measure the success of your teams. And I'm interested to hear what you're seeing about this, Steve, as well, because there's a couple of reasons to do this. And one of them, which is sort of the most practical, is that sometimes you need to be able to demonstrate that this big cultural shift that you're trying to push is actually successful, both to, possibly within your own team, but also to the powers that be, the people who hold the purse strings, in case there's investment required in terms of shifting skills or retraining or buying new tools. And I get a lot of questions about measurement. So what to measure, how to measure, and how to make sure you're measuring early enough so that you can demonstrate the before and the after. So I'm wondering what you see there, Steve. Any bits of advice or any success stories, or what do you think about the whole measurement idea?
Well, I completely agree. There has to be measurement, right? Especially when you're doing something as significant as really changing the way the business reacts and the way the business functions. That's what this change in the culture really is. And so the measurements have to be there. Now, it's always good to have a baseline. So whatever you're doing today to try to understand what that baseline is. And that baseline is of a few things. One is, how often are you getting releases out the door? Right? That's an easy one. How often are you getting releases out the door? But it's not just about getting releases out the door. It's another thing is how many, we call them escaped defects. How many bugs are found once it's in production? So you're actually trying to test the quality of what you're releasing once it's outside, right? How many support tickets are coming in, how many bugs are found, things of that nature, right? Get that done. And then the other, which is really the most important thing, because no matter what you're doing, whether you transform, whether you do the culture, whether you do the shift left, the whole reason why we release software, why we release services and applications, it's for business value. Is the business getting the value that they expected? Are they getting more than what they expected? Are they getting less than what they expected? Those are three quick, high-level areas to try to track at first, right, to get a baseline, and then those are what you're tracking moving forward as you're going into this agile, this continuous delivery, this continuous deployment. As you're doing these processes, trying to get quicker releases out, are you getting the value that you expect? Are you getting the applications out the door quickly? So those things are quick areas. There's many other things that you can measure, but if you wanted to check three high level, that's what I would say.
Yep, and I think that sort of answers another question that I wanted to ask. But I wanted to ask, if you're sold on continuous testing, how do you convince executives that it's the right thing to do? And that's very clearly one way, right, is to demonstrate the business impact that it can have from a broader perspective, right, on the business.
Now, some people will say, well, how can I correlate exactly what I'm testing and how quickly I'm doing it to the business value? And, sometimes it's not, and I'll be honest, it's not that easy to correlate what you've done with what's in the business value. But what I say is, look, you're getting applications and getting services out the door. Is the business value there? Is the business value improving? Are you getting those metrics, whether it's revenue, adoption, engagement? Are you getting them? Then great, because then the business isn't going to argue with how you're doing it, right? So sometimes there's not. Sometimes there's an easy way of correlating. You put the requirement in saying we're doing this because we're expecting to have revenue, we're expecting to get engagement, and then you can track that. Other times it's more soft, but being able to track that business value is key.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you know what else I think is really interesting when I talk to organizations that have done this successfully is that I also hear about the importance of top-down and bottom-up buy-in to this idea. So you do have to convince, executives and the higher-level folks that there's value in this, but you also have to convince everyone on the team, lower-level folks that are actually impacted by these changes, that it's good. It's good for them. It's good for their careers. It's good for the product that they're delivering. And I think there's a lot of sort of not really tricks, but, things you can do around that. So in terms of, trying to inspire individuals to become champions of this idea and sort of try to spread it amongst their peers and, stuff like that. Sometimes I think the bottoms up can be almost more challenging than the top down. Do you know what I mean?
Well, yeah, but it does have to be both. If you don't have the top buy-in, then any sort of initial investments that you need and changes, they're going to push back. So you need that buy-in. But what you don't want is you don't want the top doing just a complete mandate and saying, do this, because that's never going to be good. And I've actually been in meetings with they happen to be German CTOs, but I was in a meeting with about 10 German CTOs, and this was years ago talking about agile, not continuous testing, but it was the same type of thing. And they said it didn't work. Well, why doesn't agile work? And I can't do a German accent, and it's probably good for everyone that I'm not trying. But they all said, we told them to go agile. They went agile. It failed. I mean, so you need the buy-in, but it can't be forced. And so, then you need that bottoms-up approach. And the bottoms-up approach, really, what you need to do is you got to get a success. So you can't try to do this broadly. Get a success, and then share that success among the other teams.
Yeah, very good point. And that can really help actually with train. So once you have that success, that can become a model that you can use to try to train other groups, how to sort of follow that same model. So cool. So let's move on from sort of the cultural shifts that are required to do this into some of the technology changes that are going to be required to help you shift left and do continuous testing. So, tools are important here and can help a lot. Again, you can't just adopt some new tools and assume that you're doing continuous testing. So it takes both the cultural and the technology changes here. But from a tools perspective, you definitely want to be looking for tools that are usable by developers and folks who have not necessarily traditionally done a lot of testing. In an ideal world, you can use the same tool. You can have the same tool being used by those folks, so the developers or the DevOps folks, as the QA pros, because that can be super helpful in terms of those two constituencies working together. Service virtualization is becoming increasingly important as organizations try to do continuous testing so that they can test certain pieces of an application without having to have everything completely finished. This correlation with business impact can be helpful from a cultural standpoint, as Steve mentioned earlier, but also from a more practical, tactical standpoint in terms of being able to prioritize fixing bugs. So when you discover a problem throughout the testing process, understanding how important it is in terms of the impact to the business so that you can prioritize when to fix it is really important. And then finally, there's a lot of integrations that are super helpful when you're trying to do continuous testing and shift left. So one is integrations with CI/CD tools, which can automate the testing process and also ensure that testing is done throughout the process. Bug tracking tools so that you can actually fix problems that are uncovered rather than just find a bunch of problems and not address them. And then finally, I'm also seeing some interesting integrations with APM tools that can help find the source of problems when you discover them throughout the testing process. So, Steve, any comments you want to make on any of these? Are there any other integrations that you're seeing customers look for or use in a really interesting way, or anything else you want to say about what you think is really important in terms of tools to look for when you're trying to do this?
Yeah, so on your second bullet, you have service virtualization. And if you expand that out and not just look at service virtualization, but you look at tools that can help with testing. Service virtualization will help with testing because you can virtualize out your backends, you can virtualize out your third parties, you can virtualize out things that you don't care about and just focus on what you want to test. That's important. But to me, that's in a larger part about environments and being able to set environments up faster. So you have test data management. Test data is a huge problem when it comes to testing. Service virtualization, when you don't have environments available or whatever, that's an issue. But really, ephemeral environments. Getting an environment to get set up and broken down on demand versus setting up these very large test environments that take weeks to set up and then no one ever wants to break down because it's going to take way too long to get it back up. So then they just sit there. So ephemeral environments, when you're doing continuous testing, becomes key. So I just take that service virtualization and expand it out. And then you mentioned automation. Automation, key, right? If you're doing a lot of manual testing, not really doing continuous testing. So automation is key. But I would take that one step further, and I would say automating the automation. One of the big problems with automation is maintenance. So if we can figure out how to get rid of some of that maintenance of those scripts and being able to auto-maintain those scripts, then you get to a place where you can do a lot more continuous testing.
Cool. Yeah. Yeah, and one other actually topic related to tools that I wondered if you wanted to chime in on is, because I know this is something you guys talk about, and that is test coverage. So like how can you use your tools or look for tools that can help you understand, how much of the code has been tested, if you've actually tested everything you want to test, and at what stage, stuff like that. How do you kind of look at test coverage from the perspective of the tools that you adopt as part of this process?
That is an excellent question. When we look at, say, regression tests today, you have thousands and thousands of tests that you put in your regression tests. And on average, the percentage of your requirements that are covered with your regression suite is 20%. Thousands of tests, so you think you're covering a lot. So really getting very good coverage analysis is key because now you can shrink up what you're testing and only test what you really need to test by having good test coverage. Now, it's not just about code coverage, and it's not just about requirements coverage. It's really about functionality coverage, and it's both. It's both the amount of code you're touching and the requirements. And combining those two together gives you a very good idea of what you really need to functionally test and functionally cover with your testing. So that is a key idea. So that's a very good point.
Yeah, and I think that's something that a lot of people struggle with, right? It's kind of figuring out like exactly what to test and whether or not they've tested everything that they should be testing. And again, that's something that like the QA pros tend to, have good advice on
Sure.
as you're shifting labs.
But one of the things that they can do is like as they're moving forward, right? If they start to monitor the code that's being changed, then they know that those areas of the code should be looked at because they'll see that code changed. The other way is having much better requirements and knowing that the requirements and tagging the requirements to tests is another way to be able to track those two. Now, to look at the code that you currently have that's out there, that's where your APM tool becomes very valuable, because your APM tool that you have, application performance monitoring, having those tools, what it'll show you is what your users are really doing. So you can see the business processes that the users are really doing that's out in production. And that will help show you what you really should be testing from a regression point of view as well. So using an APM tool, using a code diff tool to really understand the differences, so that'll be automated, you don't have to do that by hand, and then really focusing, this comes to a culture change, focusing on making sure that you're tagging your test requirements or getting something that will take a requirement and auto-create test cases from that is also very beneficial.
Yeah, that's actually really interesting. I'm glad you said that about that, because I tend to think of the APM tool integration as more around root cause analysis if you're discovering a problem that's in production code. But that's a really interesting way to leverage your APM tool to kind of correlate what's
and
going
I would
on.
say, and the APM tool I think is one of the most undervalued tools. The other thing you can do with an APM tool, don't just focus on production. If you bring that into your testing environments, now you can do root cause when you find the problem in testing. So the APM tool is a very versatile tool.
Yeah, that's a great point. Cool. So this is my last slide. I wanted to kind of circle back to the topic of organizational models here. And I wanted to sort of talk through some of the different models that I see out there, and would be interested to hear what you're seeing, Steve, if it sort of corresponds. I feel like the names that I have given to these models are really bad, but I'll talk you through it. So, you've got your traditional model where you've got your QA folks in a center of excellence, and you've got, your development cycle that is complete before it gets passed off to the QA folks. And this basically leads to all of the problems that we started out with here. So it just tends to be a very slow process. Testing becomes a gate. People begin to skip testing because it's slowing them down. So I'm seeing these other three models pop up. So one of them I think of as embedded, and this is where you have a QA specialist embedded in, say, a DevOps team. And they're the person who's really responsible for doing a lot of the testing, for ensuring that testing is happening throughout the process. This is a fine model, but I think for sort of obvious reasons, it's probably best suited to really, really huge organizations that can afford to have a QA specialist on all of their teams. So I don't see this very often, but I have heard some people doing this. So another model is the one that I think of as hybrid, and this is really sort of the most common model that I'm hearing about, and we sort of alluded to it earlier. And this is where you've got QA specialists that, they may live in a COE, or they generally live in, in IT, and they serve as sort of service providers. So they set up the tooling, they advise teams, individual development teams on what they should be testing and how to ensure that things are integrated with their CI/CD pipeline. They're sort of the experts that almost consult with these individual teams to make sure that they're doing QA right and to help them do testing. And then finally, I see this sort of dev test ops model, and this is usually not super successful. I think of this as organizations that basically do away with QA pros altogether, and they try to do all QA or have all the testing being done by DevOps teams. Usually these are people who don't have a deep history in testing, and so they're sort of relying on a new breed of tool that is easier to use. This isn't, this is something that maybe smaller organizations do if you can't afford to have a QA specialist. Again, it's not usually super successful because you often don't end up with the most sophisticated testing because the people doing it don't have the deep experience that QA pros have. So these are sort of the models that I'm seeing. Steve, you seeing anything different, or do you have any sort of different assessments of these, of how successful each of these models are?
I've actually seen sort of, it'll sound funny, a hybrid of your hybrid and embedded. So what I see is a lot of these COEs are now farming out the individual testers into these teams. But they're not stuck into one team, so they're not just dedicated to one team. They actually are shared across multiple teams. So they're doing a lot of work. They're doing double, triple duty, trying to get testing done for multiple Scrum teams all at the same time, while you still have the enablers that are in the central team still helping out the testers and the developers get more done and be more productive. Just because you now might have these testers that are embedded, let's say, inside these Scrum teams, doesn't mean that developers aren't doing testing, right? You still have developers doing more testing than they ever have, but you do have these individual testers that are in these Scrum teams that are doing the more intensive work and working with the developers to really understand the requirements, to really get those test cases done, developed, so that they can test during the development. So I'm seeing that. The dev test ops, I agree with you. What we saw earlier, one, we saw that, okay, a lot of these newer groups are saying we don't need testers at all. We're just going to do it all because it's dev. We saw that wasn't overly successful. They were pushing out stuff faster and releasing with risk. As you were said earlier on, you talked to these larger companies where they were doing almost no testing, just releasing with risk. And so that didn't go out too well. But then trying to have a DevOps person who's actually not in one of the Scrum teams try to do the testing, it's almost like you're almost trying to throw over the wall to a DevOps person who doesn't have any sort of skills in order to properly test, and they're trying to sort of get some automation done on the fly while it's passing over the conveyor belt. So I agree with you, the dev test, we can call it dev test ops, because even if you're talking about continuous testing, I would say continuous testing is part of dev test ops. But I know what you're talking about. You're talking about the developers are supposed to be doing testing, then you end up having this group trying to do the integrated testing and try to get the security testing in and maybe try to do some performance testing, but try not to slow down the whole deployment. And that is definitely not successful. But the hybrid and the embedded combined, I've seen work quite well at companies.
Yeah, and I've seen that too, where folks kind of parachute in, as an expert and kind of help people get set up and then maybe move on to the next group kind of thing. So yeah, so a lot of experimentation going on and a lot of sort of successes and lessons being learned from things that aren't working so great. So I have one additional quick question that I wanted to throw at you before handing off to your slides, and that is, how do you know, if you are trying to do this, if you're trying to implement continuous testing and do shift left, how do you know if you're doing it right? Like, how do you know if you are doing continuous testing?
How do you know if you're doing it? Well, I guess...
Or doing it right.
Well, we're doing it right. I mean, really, the proof's in the pudding. right? So once it's released, once your service or your application, whatever it is, once it's out into production and being used by whoever the users are, if the quality exists and it's a regular constant occurrence that the quality exists, then you're probably doing it right. That goes back to the metrics that you're measuring, right, to see that. Now, the other thing is if you are getting what you believe is the testing done during that 2-week sprint, if you can show a burn-down chart of bugs found, and you can see that performance testing, security testing, functional testing, API testing, GUI testing is all actually being accomplished, and you can see that, and you can see the automated scripts are being associated with the requirements and things of that nature during the sprint, then that's another indication that you know things are going in the right direction. But if you are seeing in your Scrum teams, you know what, our Scrum teams aren't finding a whole lot of bugs in their sprints, it doesn't mean that you have great developers. It just means you're not testing enough. So if you don't see a spike in bugs and things and a burn down during that week or 2 weeks, that means you should start questioning, because you didn't just all of a sudden grab these wonderful developers that create 0 bugs.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think I think the issue sometimes when new concepts like this emerge is people are looking for a set-in-stone model to try to reproduce. And I think it's a little different, for every organization. It's going to depend on the culture you have. It's going to depend on your flexibility to implement tools and technologies. And I think at the end of the day, if you do measurement right, and that your measurement includes high-level goals like we want to move faster and have a more quality, reliable product, and if you're able to measure whether or not you're achieving those goals, then you're successful, right? So if you're able to release faster and if your product is more quality because of these processes that you're putting in place, then I'd say you're doing it right. Whether or not the way you're doing it looks like what's the way someone else is doing it. That's kind of what I think.
Correct. Correct. But one thing I do want to mention, everything you said is correct. And I just want to let people know, look, you're going to have struggles. Things aren't going to work. Just like with Agile, it's all about analyzing, figuring out, and moving forward. Just because you hit a roadblock doesn't mean stop, it won't work for your company. Not what it means. It just means figure out what went wrong, improve upon it, and keep moving forward.
Yep, for sure. The sort of old, fail often and learn from your mistakes thing applies here, like it does elsewhere in your processes.
Yeah,
so,
but I've talked to so many companies like, oh, we tried, we failed, we stopped. But,
really?
Well, why? Well, we tried it for 5 months, 6 months, or we tried it for a year. It just didn't work. It just doesn't work for us. No, it just means you just have to analyze and fix it. Don't go back, because it's so easy to revert back to doing everything waterfall, because that's what everyone's comfortable with doing. So easy to do that, right? But just fail forward. Fail forward.
Yeah, and again, that gets back to this whole idea of measurement, because if you're saying it just doesn't work for us, you should be able to look at, what's been going on, why does it not work for you? And so if you're collecting the right measurements about what you're doing, you should be able to identify, what the point of failure is so that you can fix it and actually, use these processes to your advantage. Yeah.
Yep.
So, cool. Well, with that, I'm going to pass the baton over to you.
So there's mine. I just throw a number up. So I'm done. Really, what these are is these are trying to show what's hindering people from doing the shift left. I think we've talked a lot about it, but what's hindering people? And so surveys were done, and this number is really an indicator of what's causing the problem. And basically, what is the biggest bottleneck into DevOps? And you can take that and you can say, why is it a bottleneck for DevOps? What's the biggest bottleneck in shifting left? What's the biggest bottleneck in continuous testing? What is it? What is the bottleneck? The bottleneck really is QA, right? It is the testing. That is the biggest bottleneck, because you have performance testing to do. You have security testing to do. You have UI testing to do. You have API testing to do. There's a lot of testing that has to get done, and it's slowing things down because the traditional set of tools just aren't enabling people to do the shift left to break down some of this bottleneck so that we can start doing that better. So like my next number, 70. Now, if you think about QA being the bottleneck, and then you see the 70, and my hint for this one is, it's not automation. So if it's not automation, Nancy, what is it?
It's manual, right? Really manual
processes.
processes.
See, that's right. 70%.
I cheated. I knew the answer.
I know you knew the answer, but we could have pretended. 70% of all testing is manual. Now, I've been in the testing world for about 20 years, and I've been using almost a similar stack the entire time. So the amount of manual testing hasn't changed, and that's crazy. And one of the reasons that manual testing hasn't changed is because automation is hard. Because when you automate, people are generally automating GUI, right? So they're automating this entire GUI so they can do their testing. Then what happens? Someone changes the UI, and then the test breaks. But it's not just one test that breaks. You have 15, 20, 30 tests that break. And so then all of a sudden everyone's saying, no, we're not going to go back and redo all that automation again. That is a pain. So therefore, we're just going to go back to manual. So now 70% of all tests are still manual. This causes the massive bottleneck because I'm trying to release fast, but you're doing manual testing. So now I'm going to release with testing almost nothing. This is a huge problem. And so that's why, actually, sorry, I shouldn't have gone to the next slide yet, but that's why I talked about automating the automation. If you can get rid of the maintenance of the scripts, if you can auto-generate the test cases, if you can auto-generate the scripts, and you can alleviate the maintenance of the scripts, automating the automation, now you can do continuous testing. Now you really help with that shift left. Because no one has to really maintain all these scripts. It's just done automatically for you. So that is huge. So that's something that people really have to look into when they're doing Agile and continuous testing and DevOps and so on. Now, the next one. All right, testing, documenting, customer validation, setup releases, stand-up reviews. I should have had one more and it would have given it away. Write code. Develop. It's all one person. This is a developer. They have to do all this in a sprint. Look at that. All this has to get done in a sprint. And generally sprints are 2 weeks. This is when I say, if you see at the top, I'm just assuming people that are on the call are laughing when they hear shift happens. Because this is what happens when you shift left. All this work gets shifted to the development teams and the Agile teams. So on average, how many hours a week do developers actually code? How many hours a week do they actually code?
I'm not going to answer because I know the answer. There you go.
Well, once you let everyone know, then, I can't even ask questions anymore. 8 hours. Think about that. 8 hours a week is all developers really have on average to actually code. That means 16 hours of coding, less, and I say less than 2 days because we know no one really works only 8 hours. So less than 2 days of coding in a 2-week sprint is all they have. Why? Because shift happens, because they have so much other work to do. So to alleviate some of the shift, you need to do, like for the testing, you need to get the automating the tests, automating the automation so that that can be done. And you want to get down to the API level, not just stay at the GUI level. So that becomes important. Now, these are other things. So, all right, so you automated your scripts. That's all ready to go. But then it goes back to something, Nancy, that you had talked about with that service virtualization. 56% of your dependencies are unavailable. So when people want to test, things aren't available for them to test. and then they have to spend days or weeks to get these environments set up so that they can test, which is a big problem. And then 50% of the time around testing is taken up by just trying to get the test data. That is crazy. And this has been there forever. Anyone who does any sort of testing knows that test data is a pain. It's very hard to do. And then to refresh that data, people don't ever want to refresh the data because it's so hard. That's time consuming. So then it goes back to, we need to look at how we can get our test environments set up quickly and broken down quickly. And the test environment doesn't need to be the entire system. It just needs to be around the thing that you need to test, and then virtualize everything else out, but you also obviously need the data in order to run it. And performance testing, as you know, needs a lot of data. So test data management, it's important for functional, but it explodes when it comes to performance. So I have this slide. I thought it was a cool phrase. Shift left or die. See, I'm all about phrases. Automating the automation, shift happens, shift left or die. I just like the catchphrases. If you don't, say you tried to do your Scrum teams and you're trying to do Agile, and then you end up having a, the word escaped me. You end up having a sprint where you're doing your testing. The hardening sprint. We're doing a hardening sprint. Well, you're just really doing waterfall. But what's happening is you don't give enough time to test. And when you do find the problems later on, then you can't fix it fast enough. Then you're pushing out without testing enough. You're pushing out, even though you know bugs are there, you're releasing with the known bugs. It's a huge problem. So you have to shift left. You have to get the testing done earlier. You have to start where the developers are. Testers need to become more technical. That's a thing. So QA people are not going away. I want to make that clear. QA people are not going away. But their skill sets have to change. They have to become more technical. They have to understand the code. They have to start testing down at the API level, not just staying at the GUI level. But they have to do it. Or the whole thing becomes a failure because the customer demands, the competitive demands are demanding that people release faster. And if you, with quality, you just can't release faster and have the thing not work and have a poor customer and user experience. So you have to shift left or it's not going to happen. And so I think people on the call will now know what this is. It's not that. That is true, though. That happens all the time, but shift happens. So finally, now I would like feedback on this. This is the first time I'm using this part of the catchphrase. We just came up with it. It's had mixed reviews internally at CA with my group, and I'll be honest, my wife as well. But shift left, we clean it up. It was originally shift left, we help, shift happens, we help alleviate the shift, some of the shift, which I liked. But then we changed it to clean it up. So I'd love feedback if people think that is maybe too descriptive as to what we do. Nancy, what is your thoughts on shift happens, we clean it up?
I think it's a hoot. I like it. I think you should keep it and use it. I think it's very funny.
I liked it, but I got feedback from others. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't point out at the bottom there. So BlazeMeter is a performance testing product. It is part of CA Technologies. So my call to action for you guys is to go to blazemeter.com/shift-left, and you'll learn more about shift left, what we're doing with the shift left, how we can help there. So I would be remiss if I did not point that out.
Cool. Cool. Well, thanks a million, Stephen. And I'm actually going to hand over to Kristen. Well, thanks to everyone on the call as well. I think this was a super interesting discussion. Hopefully you all did too. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Kristen for just some closing housekeeping items.
Great. Thank you so much, Nancy and Steve. As Nancy mentioned, that does conclude today's webcast. As a quick reminder, the on-demand version will be available on Bright Talk soon. And on behalf of CA Technologies and 451 Research, thank you for attending and have a great day.